When economic times are good, we really don't hear a lot about the Federal Reserve. They're sort of pushed to the background. So when Wells Fargo needs to go ahead and borrow some money in order to meet its reserve requirement, they can do so from other banks, maybe TD Bank, Chase Bank, SunTrust, and this is going to happen on an everyday basis. So banks go ahead, they loan out money to other banks, and then these are really short loans, overnight loans as they call them, and it's just a way for these banks to go ahead and be efficient, basically just going ahead in order to meet its reserve requirements. However, when economic times turn bad, that's where the Federal Reserve does step in quite often, and why they're known as the lender of last resort. So take the same scenario. Suppose that Wells Fargo needs a loan in order to meet its reserve requirement, but during bad economic times, other banks are in distress as well. So whereas they could go to TD Bank, Chase Bank, SunTrust Bank before, these banks are under distress and they may not be able to lend out money that they could normally do under normal circumstances. So in order for the Wells Fargo to meet its reserve requirement, they can't go to other commercial banks, but they can always rely on the Federal Reserve. So during an economic crisis, the Federal Reserve can and will provide loans when no one else can. So Wells Fargo, they always have a backup plan in order for them to meet its obligations with the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is always there, ready to intervene or ready to help out any bank in distress, and we are very glad that they do so. And we do notice that the impacts of the past financial recession in 2008 would have been a lot worse without the Federal Reserve's intervention. And the Federal Reserve did a lot of things that were sort of out of their usual toolbook in order to help stabilize the business cycle. The Federal Reserve lent out more than $2 trillion to banks and other financial institutions, which dramatically altered the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. So before, the Federal Reserve only really dealt in very, very safe and secure assets, so the treasury bills or the T-bonds that we talked about before. However, the past financial recession in 2008, the Great Recession, was a sort of unique economic event that necessitated the intervention of the Federal Reserve into doing things that they hadn't necessarily done before. So not only sort of lending out a lot of money to the smaller institution banks that they normally do, but also investing in very risky assets as well. So take a look at this particular chart right here. We see a red line and we have a blue line right here. So the blue line are these treasury bills, and we can consider these to be very safe assets. The red line that we see right here are these mortgage-backed securities, so we can consider these to be very risky assets. Before the Great Recession, we noticed that the Federal Reserve never invested at all in these risky assets at all. So that's where we have a zero all the way until 2008. But we noticed that, hey, they only invested in these very safe assets. So here we see that all the sort of things that the Federal Reserve invested in were only safe assets and zero risky assets before the financial recession in 2008. However, once the recession hit, what do we notice? We notice that this is a very, very unique event, economic event, and this is where the Federal Reserve did step in, and they bought all these risky assets from the banks in order to make sure that they did not fail or they did not sort of face any type of solvency crisis. So they had zero risky assets before, but after the financial crisis, we see that they nearly invested in $1.2 trillion worth of these risky assets, along with the safe assets with the treasury bills. So once again, the Federal Reserve, as the lender of last resort, did things in order to help stabilize the economy, making sure that things didn't get worse than they were during this time period. And even after the financial recession, after the Great Recession, we noticed that the Federal Reserve continued to keep on investing in these very risky assets, the mortgage-backed securities, with it surpassing pretty close to $1.3 trillion. And it wouldn't be surprising to see, if this were carried out even more, that the Federal Reserve continue to keep on investing in very risky assets due to the impacts of the coronavirus, and seeing exactly how much money they're actually pumping into the economy in order to prevent another recession, or sort of preventing the sort of strong recession that may be resulting as a result of the pandemic that we have here. So the Federal Reserve, once again, is acting out of its own interest and to make sure that the U.S. economy is doing the best that it can, and it has a lot of tools at its disposal. So in the next sort of section, we take a look at these three specific tools, and these are the primary tools that the Federal Reserve does use in order to sort of smooth out our business cycle. But the Federal Reserve does things typically out of the ordinary, and when economic times do call for it, or when when the economic times do have a need for it, as we can see with our past financial recession and also with the recession caused by the coronavirus. So here, that's where the Federal Reserve is essentially pumping in as much money as it can into the economy. So there is very, very high liquidity within the marketplace right now. And we want to go ahead and see the three primary tools which the Federal Reserve can do or can sort of enact in order to make sure that it balances out the business cycle that we have.